Well, I'm delighted to be here with Ross Douthat. He's a regular columnist for the New York Times. Also, he's the host of the podcast Interesting Times. And speaking of interesting times, I just think Ross is one of the brightest and most interesting people writing today on culture, religion, politics. So I wanted to talk to you for a long time. Also, he's the author of this new book, Believe, which we'll talk about quite a bit. I think a really good book of apologetics, fundamental theology. So we have a lot to talk about. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Those are very flattering introduction. We'll see if I can live up to it.
Let's see. We'll test you for the next hour. I have every confidence. Let me start with this. When I was a doctoral student in Paris many years ago, François Mitterrand was the president of France, right? The famous socialist, left-leaning guy. He was asked one time about his religious faith, and I presume he was, born and raised a Catholic. He said, well, the ethics of Christianity are great. But then he said, but la métaphysique, no one takes the metaphysics seriously. The dogmas, no one believes. And I thought of him when I read the beginning of your book where there's the atheists, both old and new, that just say it's a bunch of nonsense. But then there's this kind of mediating position. Well, no one believes the substance of it, but it's a good framework to hang our ethics on, or it informs our morals.
Right.
And you're unhappy with that. You're not satisfied with that, what I think really is a patronizing view toward religion. You do worry about la métaphysique. You do worry about the truth claim of religion.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth worrying about, right? It seems like, since it does touch on the most fundamental questions about, life and death and who we are. I think what you have in our culture now, though, is something that goes a little bit beyond the Mitterrand shrug, right?
Yeah.
Where you have a number of people who sort of take the Mitterrand view, but go one step further and say, well, it would be nice if
it were true.
If la métaphysique, c'est vrai, right? It would be nice, but could one really believe that?
Yeah.
And I think there are more of those people maybe in the 2020s than there were in the 2000s and 2010s. I think we've lived through a period of time where secularism has advanced, where sort of, the famous new atheists had a moment in the sun. And people, especially in the United States, but also in Western Europe, I think feel very dissatisfied with where that's taken us. And so then the question becomes, for people who do believe in the metaphysique, right? We can keep lapsing into French throughout this conversation.
Feel free.
Is whether you can take those people one step further, right? Whether you can take the opportunity and say, well, not only would it be nice if it were true, but there is in fact a pretty good argument that it is true after all.
Yeah. Are you surprised the new atheists faded as quickly as they have? I remember, they were all the rage in the early zeros, like right after September 11th, which is not an accident, it seems to me, that September 11th revived the old Enlightenment view that religion is irrational, therefore violent. And I remember talking to a young physician here at the Mayo Clinic, and he was a high school student in Ireland, right when all this was all the rage. And he said, Dawkins and Hitchens, they swept through our high school, Catholic high school classrooms. We all believed them. But now they've really faded. Are you surprised by that, how quickly it went?
I mean, I think the new atheists deserve a lot of credit for making some pretty concrete predictions about the world. Like, I'm in the punditry business, and there's always a temptation to sort of hedge and be vague and say, on the one hand, on the other hand. Yeah. And Hitchens, Dawkins, they just came out and straightforwardly said, the less religion, the better the world will be, right? Get rid of the Bronze Age superstitions and the sky god and the flying spaghetti monster, and the world will become more enlightened and rational and scientific and so on. And if you're looking for a story about their fade, I think you just have to say that 10 or 15 years of a further retreat from religion has yielded basically the opposite of what they predicted. Nobody looks around at U.S. politics today and says, as we've got less religious, we became less polarized, more trusting of medical and scientific authority. So in that sense, I think that they were victims of their own willingness to sort of push their chips in, right? And say, leave God behind and the world will become a better place. Because then if you get the world we live in, people will naturally look around and say, well, even if there's no God, that style that claim, that promise didn't work out terribly well.
Right.
To be fair, there's still plenty of people who, I have had these debates, you've had these debates, who hold effectively new atheist perspectives on the world. It just doesn't have the cultural currency that it did in that kind of post 9/11 moment.
Yeah. A couple of things that kind of intrigue me still about the new atheists. One is, how poorly informed they were about sophisticated approaches to religion. So dealing with straw men all the time, and they betrayed very little sense of what serious theists believe about God. That there's a philosophically, coherent account of God that rarely figured in. But the second thing that still surprises and kind of infuriates me, how bad we were, religious people, at dealing with them. The great exception is William Lane Craig, the Protestant philosopher, who was using a lot of the Catholic intellectual tradition. But when I'd watch those debates between like Hitchens and somebody else or Dawkins, the pathetic performance of the religious people. And this confirms my view that we had dumbed down the faith for so long that we lost our own ability to defend ourselves against relatively superficial metaphysical positions.
Yeah, it seemed like you couldn't, turn on public television for a while without seeing Dawkins or Hitchens having their way with some, I would say hapless, well-meaning bishop, but that would be the right.
True.
But I think part of it was that there was a kind of cultural equilibrium before that moment that was a little bit like the Mitterrand line, right? Where people who had ceased to believe or practice the faith or practice a faith would say things like the French president that, religion is good as far as it goes, but I don't believe in the miracles or the dogma. And religious people had gotten used to arguing in that landscape. And so to have people come along and say, no, it's all rotten, God is not great, how religion poisons everything.
Right.
To sort of take the fight more seriously in the old 18th century Enlightenment, écraser l'enfant, Voltairean style. Yes, I think absolutely. Religious leaders and sort of believers weren't prepared for that. I think the internet also played a role here, that you had a kind of, you mentioned the new atheists going through a Catholic high school or something like a whirlwind. If you were doing religious education or running a church youth group or these kind of things before the internet, I think you got kind of used to having a quasi-captive audience, right? You've got these kids and you're the religious authority, and obviously they have other authorities, but the other temptations are sort of moral temptations, drinking and sex and drugs and so on. The idea of these teenagers suddenly being able to go on the internet and be exposed to someone in a charming British accent explaining why, their youth pastor is full of it. I think that was something that the churches had no inoculation against.
How pathetic that was, that even our youth pastors or high school teachers weren't able to make a fundamental case along the lines of a C.S. Lewis, or along the lines that, you're proposing in your book too, that we couldn't engage in that kind of fundamental apologetics. That is a tragedy. I lived through that time. I lived through dumbed down Catholicism. And I think the New Atheist period proved in a way what a disaster that was. Pastorally speaking, not just intellectually, but pastorally. We lost a lot of young people because of our inability to engage their minds. When you read the accounts of why people left, I'm always struck by, we didn't get our questions answered.
Yep.
Science refutes religion. Religion is stupid. Bronze Age. They'll use all the Hitchens language. But that's a failure on our part too, on the part of religious leadership.
Yeah, and I think you had patterns of sort of treating people with questions as problems, right? It's like, and again, these are stereotypes and you don't want to lean too much into the stereotypes, but the idea of the troublesome kid in religious education who asks too many questions and so on it's a cliche, right? For a reason, because it does exist. And being ready with actual responses to that when you suddenly have a multiplication of the number of people with those questions is something that you absolutely needed and didn't have. I think one theory I have is just that, in a weird way, institutions sometimes have to decline to some particular degree before they can start to recover, right? Yeah. Mid-century American Catholicism was an incredibly powerful force in American culture that then entered into a period of chaos in the 1970s and then a period of decline. And it's not clear to me that you could sort of get new vitality without having a certain degree of turnover and indeed loss. I mean, sometimes when you write a book, people always ask, why now, right? Why write a book like this now? And I'm not completely sure, because in certain ways, almost none of the arguments that I make in the book couldn't have been made 15 years ago or something. But as a writer, you're trying to read the culture, right? You're trying to say, when are people ready to hear a particular argument? And I think there is a way in which a period of religious decline actually clears away a lot of sort of misconceptions, bad ideas, failed strategies, and also lets people approach things new. I think one of the novel things about our era is that you really have a large population of people in the United States, maybe for the first time in our history, who have almost no exposure to religion at all. Right? And that's bad in many ways, but it also means that they aren't carrying some sense that like, oh, I already heard all that in Sunday school or catechism class. There are people who have more openness, who are like, well, I haven't heard about this at all. This is interesting. Tell me about it.
Well, that's a good segue in a way to your approach to, I'd call it apologetics or fundamental theology, how to make a case, for God. Yours, it's a cousin to Aquinas' sort of teleological thing, but it's more contemporary, because it seems to me you rely on intelligibility, that there's something remarkably intelligible about the world. Joseph Ratzinger makes that very succinct argument, that the universal intelligibility of the world upon which all of science rests. You can't do science unless you assume the world's intelligible. That universal intelligibility can only be explained through recourse to some intelligence that has thought it into being. You bring it out with a greater scientific precision. And it strikes me as a hopeful way to do it for a lot of people for whom science is the great thing. Science is the ultimate. And you're saying, well, but what are the conditions for the possibility of science? Isn't it something like an ordered universe that would point towards something like someone who's thought it into being? It strikes me as a hopeful way to go about it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm a journalist, not a philosopher, not a scientist either. But I am very self-consciously, I think, trying to make arguments that are one degree sort of closer to the ordinary flow of conversation than the most philosophically sophisticated case for God. Because while I agree with you that the new atheists, their arguments were simplistic and reductive relative to the highest level case for God, at the same time, if God is real, and if, as the Catholic Church teaches, certain things about God can be known through reason alone, then they should be intelligible to people who aren't going to crack open the Summa Theologica, right? And I think that the argument that what science has revealed about the world not only doesn't undermine the argument that there probably is some kind of creative guiding intelligence, but actually strengthens that argument is, I think, a good one. I think it's true. Two, I think it's a good counter to the casual assumption that, like, well, with every step of scientific progress, we must move naturally further away from religious obscurantism and doctrine. And, there are areas where scientific discoveries and arguments pose real challenges for religious faith. And, the debate about Darwinism and evolution was a sort of, turbulent argument, a challenging argument for Christianity. And for biblical religion generally, for a reason. I wouldn't deny that. But I think if you look at the last 100 years, but especially maybe the last 40 or 50 years of what we've learned about not just the intelligibility of the cosmos, but the extent to which it is so carefully ordered to yield that intelligibility, you're dealing with evidences that are, if you had described them in advance, if you had said to an atheist 70 years ago, here's what we're going to figure out about how precisely fine-tuned the universe is for life, they would have been deeply skeptical, and they would have said, well, if that happened, that would be evidence for religion. And that I think is an important thing to see, that of course you can't resolve permanently through debate the question of God. People will be arguing about it until the eschaton. But you can say, well, these things that we've learned, you have to concede that they've strengthened the case for religion. I think there are a lot of examples of that in science, in what we've witnessed with the durability and persistence of religious experience under these allegedly secular and disenchanted conditions. I think there's a lot of ways in which you can go back to the arguments between atheists and believers in the 18th century or the 19th century and say, the things we've learned since then have strengthened the believer's hand.
Do you know that article I cited a lot by Eugene Wigner, who was a younger contemporary of Einstein, a theoretical physicist, a secular Jew, who writes the article called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. What struck him after a whole career of doing high abstract theoretical physics, why should it be the case that I have to use the highest mathematics to describe the structure of reality? Why should that be the case? He's not religious. He doesn't talk about God, but he talks about the miracle of this, the strangeness of it. And it touches too on your question about consciousness. Like, what is it about the correspondence between our minds and the mathematical structure of reality? That's not just here by some kind of dumb chance or random set of circumstances, right?
Right. It's very easy to, just as it's easy to imagine universes, it turns out, where the basic laws and constants never allow for life to get off the ground. It turns out that the odds of this kind of universe, as opposed to a dead universe, are, 1 in a quadrillion, 1 in a quadrillion, like absurd probabilities. Yeah. No, I think the same is true for both consciousness itself, the mystery of self-awareness and the ability to seemingly stand outside the world a bit and reason about it. It's very easy to imagine, all kinds of cosmoses that have some kind of life and have no consciousness, right? So it's strange that we got one with consciousness. The fact that we did seems like, again, a point for religion. And then, yes, the fact that conscious reason works, and there are all of these correspondences between, figuring out how mathematics works and then figuring out that you can use this to unlock the physical secrets of reality. And this is something, I've argued this back and forth with people. For some people, it just seems intuitive. They're like, well, of course, if you evolve some kind of reasoning faculty to let you dodge predators in the Serengeti, it just makes sense that reasoning faculty would scale up to all these other problems. And
hopelessly reductionist.
I don't think that's right at all. No. I think even if you stipulate that some kind of reason is useful for primordial survival, there's no reason you should expect that capacity to also let you figure out the fundamental laws of physics, right? Especially, when you're into totally mysterious territory like quantum physics.
Right.
There are all kinds of things that we've been able to do with our reason that I don't think you could reasonably predict given, accidentally evolved premises.
Quite right. There's the philosophical Kantian argument that, no, these are just a priori's already in the mind, so of course we read them into reality. But that just begs the question about where did this internal intelligibility come from? Where did this highly complex mind come from? So it just kind of postpones that question. Aquinas defines truth as adequatio re et intellectus. So we say the correspondence between mind and reality. But adequatio is an interesting word, like the sort of coming together of mind and reality. And I thought of that when I was reading your book, the intelligibility of the world, but then also this extraordinary capacity of the mind to enter into that intelligibility and to grasp it. Again, the unlikeliness of that in a purely random physicalistic universe.
Well, and also to get even weirder and more speculative, right? The apparent capacity of mind, consciousness, observation to actually shape reality itself, right? And this is where, you don't want to lean too hard on this argument because quantum physics is there's an inherent mystery
Spooky,
there.
yeah,
There's an
right.
inherent spookiness that, could yield to multiple interpretations. But at the very least, it is quite striking that one of the simplest explanations of certain aspects of quantum reality is that conscious observation is necessary
makes a difference,
to
yeah.
turn contingency into reality, which in turn is, of course, a version of what theists have been saying all along when we suggest that consciousness is what sustains the universe in being at any given moment, that you actually can't have reality itself without mind as a primary thing. Again, if you had said in 1840 that at the bottom of physics, as far down as we could go, you will find some sort of strange interaction between mind and matter that suggests that mind has some primary role,
Yeah.
the sort of materialist atheistic perspective would have been to scoff. And yet that is what we have in contemporary scientific theory.
And it's Bishop Berkeley. That goes way back. Esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. And so Berkeley speculates, indeed, God is the one that's always perceiving the universe. How that old philosophical theory is being ratified by the most contemporary theoretical physics is kind of fascinating to me. Ratzinger said to believe in God is to believe in the primacy of logos over and against mere matter. It's a succinct, neat way to put it, I think.
Yes.
See, when you say mere matter, the problem philosophically is there's no such thing as mere matter. Matter is always at a particular intensity or speed or color or position or configuration, right? You say matter and energy is the fundamental reality. It can't be. Because you say, well, matter in this form. Well, why this form and not that form? At this speed, well, why that speed and not some other speed? At this heat, why that heat, not some other heat? In other words, matter always begs the question, why? So you can't say matter is the fundamental reality. You've got to say something that transcends matter. So the primacy of logos over and against mere matter is what it means to believe in God. And I think you're pointing in the direction of that intuition.
No, I in cruder and non-Ratzingerian terms, I've tried to make that case in arguments with non-believers who are sort of open to these kind of speculations. I feel like in having conversations about this subject, you often encounter people who will sort of go a little distance with you, who will say, well, that's interesting about the fine tuning of the cosmos, or, but why do you have to call it God? Right. And so sometimes you just sort of start by saying, well, let's just talk about mind and matter. Right. And these are the two things we have access to in our lives. We have access to our conscious experience of the world, what it is like to have consciousness. That is, in a way, the undeniable fact of human experience, even though people like Daniel Dennett are there to deny it, right? People do deny it. But you have that, and then you have material reality that you encounter through your conscious experience. And just at that starting point, there doesn't seem to be any necessary reason why you should say, well, we should prefer to say that the thing we experience secondarily is the primary thing in the universe, and the thing we experience directly, undeniably, is the secondary thing. I don't. And then once you have conceded that possibility, I don't see why you wouldn't lift up from that to say, well, if mind is primary and our minds are one manifestation of mind, presumably there are higher manifestations than our own. I just taped a podcast with actually one of the new atheists, I guess, Sam Harris, who's a very interesting figure because he's very into meditation.
He wants some spirituality.
He's very interested in ideas about mind. Yeah. And I think he and I could achieve not agreement, but some sort of common ground in talking about, direct experience is undeniable. Mind is perhaps some essential aspect of the universe. But then he's hung up on, the idea that if there were a God, he could manifest himself through scriptures from 2,000 years ago that seem to Sam Harris's 21st century mind to be antiquated and so on, right? Like everyone has a different point where they want to sort of stop the train.
Right. Right. As I was reading your book on these issues, I kept thinking of this metaphor that's helpful to me. God is like the author of a book So you think of a great novel like a Tolkien or something, sprawling,
Hypothetically, Tolkien.
sprawling narrative. Yeah. And Tolkien's mind is in every nook and cranny of that book. Yeah. Every comma, every period, every subplot, every character, everything is shaped by Tolkien's mind. But the one thing you'll never find in the book is Tolkien. Tolkien's not a character in the novel. I think atheists, both old and new, always make that category error. I'm looking around the physical universe for evidence of God, or I'm looking for God. Where is he? What's the fame of the cosmonaut? Goes up into outer space. Right. I've been up in the heavens. There's no God.
There's no God, comrade.
It's a category mistake. That God is, in fact, everywhere in the universe. His mind, not just from a deist distance, but is now actively thinking the world into being. So God can be seen everywhere. But God is not in the universe that he's made, not an item in it. And that's the mistake I think a lot of the atheists have made, both old and new.
No, well, they want, just not to cross the podcast streams, but Harris said to me something to the effect of, well, I would believe in God if he had just encoded written down the laws of physics in the New Testament, right? If it was like, just give me the strongest possible indicator that someone is writing this story, right? And for Harris, that would be, something, Jesus says, blessed are the meek. And by the way, you won't understand this for 2,000 years, but E equals MC squared. And I do think, I said this to him, and I've said, like, it is the case that in taking this authorial role, God allows for people not to believe in him, right? Yeah. Like the system is, I'm sure you find this as an apologist for Christianity. It would be easier to be an apologist for Christianity if we, snapped our fingers in the course of an argument and someone levitated behind us on command. And God could have he could have written the story that way. And so there is some mystery here, or some aspect of God's plan where it is important for people to live inside the story without acknowledging the author. That the allowance for that is clearly part of the universe that we have. But yes, the story, I like that argument as a writer. Of course, everyone imagines God as the highest possible version of the thing they do. The computer engineer is like, God is the engineer. The writer is like, God is a storyteller. But I found that useful too for arguing about the question of that people also raise, like, all right, there might be a God, but how could this God possibly care about every single person, right? You get a lot of people who will say, it's immodest to imagine that the author of the universe cares that much about what
Dickens
you or
crying over the death of one of his characters.
Right, and that's if Tolkien or Dickens or any other novelist can care, in a limited way. There's only so many characters you can create, but Dickens cares about all his characters. He's palpable. Utterly responsible for every one of them in every detail. See, that's why I like the metaphor, because it touches upon providence. And Aquinas says God's providence extends to particulars. We think in a deist way about maybe at high levels, God is providential, but that's not the way a novelist. His providence extends to every particular in the story, right? No, I think that's very illuminating. It handles a lot of problems within theology, that image. All right, we've been talking about philosophy, which I love. That's my background. I love philosophical approaches, and they appeal to a lot of people, and especially scientifically minded people, I think might find this approach, illuminating. But I also love the part of your book where you talk about the spookier side of religion. And now I speak here, I've been a philosophy professor and theology professor, but I've also been a pastor. I've been a priest for 40 years, worked in parishes. I find the kind of stories you told there about, what will we say, experiences of a higher world that break into our world. Once you scratch the surface, they come roaring out. A lot of people have these experiences. I remember Andrew Greeley, who was my Chicago priest colleague many years ago, he said, we're a nation of mystics, because he uncovered that too in his statistical research. And I found it pastorally, especially like near-death experience. If you start talking about near-death, suddenly the whole room, everyone's got a story about it. I love the story about the German radio that sprang to life. Tell that if you can, like in brief compass, because I thought it was So this is a story that I take from Michael Shermer, who is of course a noted atheist, skeptic of religion, critic of religion. who I have actually debated. And to his great credit, he had a spooky thing happen to him and his fiancée, his new wife. When they were married, she had a radio that had been a gift from an older relative who had passed away from Germany, who had been the kind of person who would have given her away at the wedding had he been alive. She was getting married in a foreign country, in California, to her, a foreign country, was feeling lonely, was with her husband's friends, and this radio was broken.
Yeah.
Schirmer had never been able to get it to work. Batteries, no batteries, it didn't matter, totally dead. And on the day of the wedding, it just starts playing from the back of the house, and you can't figure out where the music is coming from.
From an iPhone.
I always feel bad. This is Schirmer's story, right? I'm stealing it for my own religious purposes, but it's a great story. He goes back, and there's the radio. It's playing, and it's playing the appropriate music for a wedding, music to dance to, love songs, and so on. He can't figure out why it's playing. It plays for a few hours through the reception into the night, stops working, never works.
And then out of commission.
Never works again.
Yeah.
And Schirmer spends time at the end of one of his books trying to construct a kind of, a pseudo-physicalist explanation for this that involves multiple universes, something like the movie Interstellar, where the guy's reaching from one timeline into another timeline. And so it's an admirable effort. But it's clearly just something that, sort of happened to him and struck him, and he's been unable to shake. And it happened even though he's not himself a believer. He didn't get down on his knees and pray for divine intervention. And this is an important aspect of 21st century reality, is that we know, in a way, again, that I think people did not know before the world became more secular, that these kind of experiences just don't go away if people stop going to church, listening to sermons, or formally believing in God. Now, they may diminish. It may be that Americans in our mystical moods have more of these experiences than hard-headed Swedes or, the secular Dutch. I don't know about that, but there probably is some connection between how mystically inclined you are and what happens. But nonetheless, you don't have to have a religious culture for religious experience to keep on breaking in. People have near-death experiences when they have absolutely no expectation of seeing anything, beyond the grave. People have encounters of what we would call the Holy Spirit when they're, not in any place where they're expecting it or believing in it. And this is just a sociological level. This is an important key to religion's resilience.
Yeah.
It's like, why doesn't religion go away? Everyone, the sociologists have all their theories about the utility of religion. Some of those are useful, but one big reason religion doesn't go away is that people keep having experiences that seem to be God, angels, demons, right?
Yep.
People, a couple people have said to me that in this moment we're in now, where people are interested in religion but have less experience of it, that they as pastors have way more people coming to them than previously saying, I'm here because I had a scary experience of something supernatural and I didn't know what to do with it, right?
Yeah.
And that whereas 15 or 20 years ago that would happen less. So it seems like you remove the structures of religion and people are sort of wandering a bit in the dark and sort of searching and groping and sometimes having good experiences, sometimes having darker ones, maybe than they would have in a more formally religious culture. And of course, that's, one reason I'm interested in this stuff is that one reason that I am a practicing Catholic today is that I sort of tagged along with my parents as a child when they went from a very straight-laced Episcopalian world into the world of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity. So I grew up as someone, I didn't have these experiences. I was
around people.
I was around people speaking in tongues,
Yeah.
sort of supernatural healings.
Yeah.
And there are people who are in those worlds who decide it's all fake. I had the opposite experience. I, again, was not awash in mystical experiences myself, but I was always quite confident that something real was happening around me. But who knows what the correct theological interpretation was, but it was an aspect of reality that we were seeing that maybe the average secular liberal person, an elite college that I ended up going to, whatever, had not encountered. But you had to fit it into your world picture.
Yeah.
No world picture could be complete. No explanation of reality could be complete without a deep explanation of what this phenomenon is. And the secular accounts are just, they feel like, sort of sketches when you're trying to capture a painting.
Such a dogmatism about it. I'll tell you a story. When I was in California, I went to this party, and there were some prominent people there, and I went with my Roman collar on, and I'm just introducing myself. This lady came up to me, and I said, "I'm a Catholic bishop," and she goes, "Well, I'm a visionary and a seer," and I said, "Oh, really?" And she said, "Yeah, and a lot of Catholic saints talk to me." I said, "Oh, really? Well, which ones?" And she said, "Well, Saint Bruno came," and that struck me like, Saint Bruno. I said, "Bruno the Carthusian?" She said, "I guess." Well, it's kind of a surreal California moment, but as a Catholic bishop, I'm not going to say, "Oh, that's so much nonsense," But what I did say to her, and it's kind of to your point, I said, well, our perspective would be, yeah, there is a higher world, and sometimes there are communications, but I'd be a little wary because not everything coming out of that channel is good. And she looked at me kind of blankly, but I think that's the right attitude toward it. There are, as there are in our ordinary experience, dark and light. So in that higher spiritual world, there's both dark and light. But the people experience it for sure, seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, right. All of Californian spirituality, I think, tends to be premised on the idea that if you just sort of go wandering, you will probably encounter an angel of light. And of course, there's some warnings in the New Testament, right, about things that appear to be angels of light. And not people have dark spiritual experiences, but they also, in kind of mystical experimentation, I think, have experiences that appear to be positive initially and maybe turn out to be less positive later on. But there is one of my other theories about this moment is that there are a lot of people who are open to religion, can't get all the way to the idea of a singular creator God or a triune creator God to get even wilder, right? But are in the kind of religious mode of looking for intermediate powers, right? The void. It's like, I don't know if I believe. I don't know what the woman you talked to would have said, but I can imagine someone saying, I don't know what I think about God, but I'm open to hearing from a saint. But that same person might be open to hearing from an angel, a ghost, a small g God, and so on. And there's a lot of that energy, I think, in the culture that also spills over into how people approach AI, how people think about UFOs, that like there's a desire for a kind of middleman between ultimate divinity and us.
It's easier to cope with, maybe.
Well, and you can, look, this is the most ancient human religious practice. Maybe you can bargain, right? Like people, there's a kind of transactional spirit that, of course, again, is a zone of danger from a Catholic perspective.
Yeah. I did my doctoral work on Paul Tillich in Dialogue with Thomas Aquinas. And Tillich, fascinating figure, But he said one time, modern people don't believe in miracles. And someone said, yeah, but look at all the people that go to, Guadalupe and Lourdes. And he said, those are not modern people, which is a lovely tautological way to handle the problem. But that's such a dogmatic reductionism, isn't it? That this is part of our experience. I love the fact that you mentioned Craig Keener in his book on miracles.
Oh, yeah.
I knew
the
Keener,
attempt to catalog.
Yeah, I knew him as a Bible scholar, a very high-level, serious Bible scholar. And then, so I'd read a number of his books. Then this book is 2 volumes. It's about this big.
Yeah.
And it account after account after account from modern times, from our time, about things that are really hard to explain. And I've recommended that book to a lot of people who are stuck in a sort of rationalism. Like, make sense of this.
Yeah. It is the kind of thing that you would expect to find in a world created by an agency that is interested in a relationship with
whose providence
us, right?
extends to particulars.
And in a world that didn't have such a God, you would expect, still some sort of law of large numbers, random happenings, but I would say many fewer correspondences between people reaching out and asking for help and having just some of the craziest things happen. And you get, I think this is where the internet, we were talking earlier about how it was an engine of secularism, when it unleashed, Christopher Hitchens on the unsuspecting
Right.
Christian youth groups. But it's also an agent of re-enchantment in its own way, in part because you can go online and, in fact, you don't want to overweight any particular case, but see, there's audio of, I think it's an evangelical pastor who had a terrible throat condition, and he's giving a sermon. He had lost his ministry because he couldn't preach anymore because he'd lost his voice. He speaks incredibly hoarsely, and he's pressed into service, and he's giving a sermon, and it's literally a sermon about miracles and why you have to have a balance between you can't expect a miracle, but you also can't say they ended with the apostles.
Yeah.
And in the course of this sermon, his voice returns to him.
Yeah.
And, again, could there be some crazy physiological explanation? Of course, in any case like that, you can say there might be, but the internet has multiplied the ability of people to encounter the proliferation of strange happenings out there. And through that, then you're still, in the end, you're still thrown back a bit on the question of why do some people get them and not others, right? And it's the same sort of allowance for unbelief is present in the miracles are not there to fix everything. That's very, very clear, right? They're there as signs and indicators and sources of help. But certainly it's true. Not everybody gets them.
Because they wouldn't be miracles if everybody got them. We wouldn't wonder at them if everyone got. They become a commonplace part of the world. So in a way, that argument is self-defeating. To be a miracle, it has to be rare.
That's true, but you do have, I've been fascinated by Carlos Ayer's book on levitating saints. They flew.
Yeah, he flew. Yes,
right. So this
was a good book.
It's a really good. He's a Yale historian, and it's about saintly levitation in the 17th century. And it's a great book to read because Ayer is this very serious academic, and it takes you a while reading this serious historical book to realize that. Well, he thinks this really happened, right? He thinks sort of you can be a historian and think this happened. But I would. Someone might reasonably say, and people have said, well, why are these saints levitating back in the 1600s? Can't we get one on video today? And I would take a levitating saint,
sure,
right now as a mode of apologetics. Of course, as soon as you had one, everyone would say it was an AI deepfake, right? So there's always room for doubt and disbelief.
I was reading that book, and then I went on a retreat at a Benedictine monastery.
And you levitated?
No, they were reading that book at table. So I sat down for dinner. Okay, God wants to tell me something here.
Well, one of the arguments I think he makes, right, is that we just actually don't have an adequate level of religious devotion to generate the levitation. So maybe the Benedictines were working their way to that level.
They were getting there. Hey, we've been talking about sort of like religion generically, God in the more abstract way, but now we have to get over Lessing's gulf. Gotthold Lessing, 18th century, says there's a great gulf that yawns between what he called the contingent facts of history and the universal truths of reason.
Yes.
And most moderns, Kant, Hegel, Schleiermacher, they're all lamenting over Lessing's gulf, Kant gets over it by just saying, I don't care about the contingent facts of history. Jesus is an archetype of the perfect moral life, and that's how he functions, and so don't worry so much about the historical Jesus and all that. But when I listen to my friend Jordan Peterson, and sometimes he reminds me of Kant, that Jesus becoming more like a psychological archetype. Right. So that's
a Jungian figure.
Yeah, and that's a way to handle it. So you say, well, I'm not going to worry about that. But of course, Christianity can't do that. And we're very concerned about the contingent facts of history because at the heart of the religion is not just an abstract belief in God as the great mind behind universal intelligibility, but this Jesus, first century Jew who said and did rather remarkable things. The claim is made that he rose from the dead physically. So my point is,
many people are saying.
True story, So we can't jump over Lessing's gulf. I mean, we have to deal with the contingent facts of history. So now the transition to Christian belief specifically. Make a case. So we've talked about God. Make a case in short compass. Why Christian belief?
Well, this is in a way another case, I think, where it's useful to have a period of kind of deconstruction so you can see the thing again for the first time. So if you present, in a fully Christian culture with a hierarchical, established, powerful church and so on, right? You have the gospel narratives presented as, their divine revelation, they're the pristine word of God and so on. But then, you get critics and skeptics who come along and say, well, they're the pristine word of God, but historically, Luke seems to have the wrong Roman governor identified in the infancy narrative, or John has the clearing of the temple at this point in the timeline, and another gospel writer has it at the synoptic gospels have it at another point, and there's this tension, this contradiction, and so on, right? And I think that we have sort of reached the end of a kind of academic intellectual process of that kind of deconstruction that has, interacted with the decline of religious power and religious institutions. And at the end point, you can sit down with the Gospels and sort of come to them fresh and say, okay, I'm not sure if these are divinely inspired, right? Maybe there is, a tension here, or, the synoptics are saying this and John is saying that. But how do they seem? Like if you were just you're presented with them fresh, you don't have any preconceptions. Don't they seem like works of first-person narrative by people who actually saw the things themselves? And when you actually dig deeper into the places where they overlap and some of the places where they seem to contradict and so on, don't you actually see that there are ways in which this piece of this gospel actually makes sense of this detail in another? There's a Protestant biblical scholar and philosopher, Lydia McGrew. I think her phrase is like, I think it's undesigned coincidences, but it's, you read the Gospels together and you're like, there are all of these reasons reading them to suppose and think that these are actually direct eyewitness accounts that are written by people who know each other or knew people who know each other, and that make sense of each other. And if there are, places where, there's something that doesn't seem to fit and so on, that is in a way what you would expect for first person account, for narratives to, to not all appear as sort of, in a way they'd be more historically suspicious if they all said exactly the same thing, right?
If all the people in this room, what was Ross Douthat wearing that day he came in the studio? Oh, a tweed jacket, I think. Well, what color was it? We're not going to get uniform answers to all those details.
Right, and you're going to get different emphases, and I don't want to get too deep into arguments about biblical inerrancy and whether is it legitimate for a gospel writer to condense a timeline or something like that. I'll leave those for the magisterium to sort out. But I think we have reached a point where it is possible to encounter the Gospels in that spirit and recognize the resilience of their credibility, even amid all of the sort of picking at this detail and that detail. And I think we've hit the same kind of process in the kind of historical analysis, where all of the attempts to claim that the Gospels are, written hundreds of years after the fact, or sort of in the same category as Gnostic Gospels and later texts and so on, all of those arguments going on for decades and centuries look pretty thin right now. And in many cases, you end up with things like, well, the best reason to think the Gospels are later is because Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple. And he couldn't have known about the destruction of the temple, couldn't he have, right? And in essence, the skeptics are sort of smuggling in their own metaphysical presumption. So my basic argument is that if you approach the New Testament and approach the Gospels especially in a sincere spirit of historical inquiry and as a sort of sincere and somewhat naive reader, you will find them to be the most compelling account of a profound religious breaking into reality available among the great religions of the world. I can't prove that to you, but I think that is certainly my personal response to them, and I think it is the reasonable response. And what that means in turn, from my perspective, is that therefore they become like, if you're a person in the world, you're a character in the story, right?
Yeah,
to go back,
right.
but you're trying to figure out what is the author up to, right? And you're like, okay, well, it's a weird place to be. You're inside a story and you're trying to, figure out what kind of story you're in and what you're supposed to do in this story. You are looking for moments of strong authorial intervention, right? Where it's like the pen seems to push particularly hard.
Right.
The author maybe has entered the story. That's the radical claim, but at the very least is sort of doing something with the story that you as a character in it need to pay attention to. I just think that the story of Jesus of Nazareth, the story of his life and death, and the claim of his resurrection is unrivaled as an example of that. And so if you are sort of approaching religion as a category and trying to do a certain kind of rational analysis of like, is there probably a God and so on, it then makes sense to treat the New Testament as a kind of interpretive framework where you say, okay, there's a lot of conclusions I could draw from the run of mystical experiences, but if I start out with the idea that, that the revelation of Jesus of Nazareth is the key revelation, then that will determine how I read this piece of evidence and how I read that piece of evidence. So that's I'm not going to say it's exactly my approach, but it's at least one way that I think about these questions.
You cite Lewis in there, I think, and C.S. Lewis, who said, people that think the Gospels are mythic just haven't read many myths. And Lewis knew a lot about myths. And I always think of that when around Easter time we read from Acts 10, and it's that speech of Peter. And he says, how things started up there in Galilee, and then the baptism by John and the Jordan, and then, things in Jerusalem about Jesus of Nazareth, and how our the elders persecuted him. And like, he's not saying once upon a time.
Right.
It's the way you'd say, yeah, you remember you were in Minneapolis and then you came down to Rochester. Remember that? Right away, what you're signaling is, I'm telling you a story about something that happened, And then when Peter says, I always find it breathtaking, we who ate and drank with him after his resurrection from the dead. I'm not in a galaxy far, far away or once upon a time. He just
not having a mythical dream.
Right. He just told me about Galilee and about the Jordan and John. I know all that. Well, and we ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. There's something deeply weird going on in that telling.
And it's so clearly Peter himself. I mean, this is one of, on the kind of biblical scholarship point, right? You're never going to prove 100% that the Gospel of Mark was the memories of Peter filtered through St. Mark. Maybe we'll find some scroll or manuscript that proves it, but pending that, it has to be a supposition. But it's a really strong supposition. Like if you read Mark and you're reading sort of the way that Peter appears in Mark in particular, and the phrases, the different things, the specific, like when a story is repeated in one of the other Gospels that's also in Mark, there's this particular flavor in many cases where you're like, oh, that sounds like how Peter would have told the story.
And if he was Peter's amanuensis, he was Peter's companion.
Right.
Mark.
And it's just, and this is, I think, true generally, that the Gospels, again, if you approach them naively without too much baggage, they just make much more sense as either direct or, one writer removed accounts of things that people really experienced, which, again, doesn't prove the resurrection, but makes it something that you have to reckon with in a way that is distinct from, a lot of other religious texts and accounts where there is more of a kind of mythic filter, more layers of history between the sacred text and the thing itself. Just the fact that you would set up your religion on the basis of, 4 different guys telling the story is kind of an amazing thing.
So we've talked about belief in God. We've now narrowed it down to Christianity, but let's get into Catholicism. So am I getting this right? I like the distinction you make between an ethical approach to religion, a more experiential, and a more liturgical, and then all 3 of those. And it's a bit like Newman, priest, prophet, and king, the different dimensions of ecclesial life. And that you find all 3 of those in Catholicism, that they come together. And I found that too. See, when I was growing up, go back to the 70s and 80s, there was a real Kantian reductionism.
Yeah.
Most people would have said something.
They wouldn't have called it that.
No, but they would have said, it doesn't really matter that much what you believe. What really matters is do you care for the poor and are you for social justice? Well, that was a popular Kantianism. Catholicism at its best has always said, yes, yes, yes. Ratzinger, in fact, I've always loved this, said the church does 3 things. It worships God, it evangelizes, and it serves the poor. Those 3. And each one implies the other. They all belong together. If you isolate one, the thing is not going to work. That to me is very illuminating. And it reminded me of your distinction there. And the part of the genius of Catholicism in particular is how it holds those 3 things together.
At its best.
At its best, yeah.
I mean, I think, it's interesting for me as someone who moved through Protestant worlds and ended up as a Catholic, that I think I was very fortunate in the part of Catholicism we ended up in, which was not traditionalist, not Latin Mass, but sort of very, very liturgical, sort of serious and intense in that way, in a way that was actually sort of correlated with the kind of mysticism that was available in Pentecostal and charismatic traditions, but in a form that had more emphasis on form and beauty and these kinds of things. But, you will meet, and I have known people who are raised Catholic who just don't find anything that seems like the direct experience of God, right? And this is, one of the main sort of pathways out of Catholicism into evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity is the sense of I have my suburban Catholic parish and we sort of go through the motions, but we never, have the encounter, right? And it's a big challenge for, I think, it's not really about liberal or conservative, but there is a suburban style of American Catholicism that sort of ended up in this, neither fish nor fowl position, where it's not as sort of personal and intense as megachurch Protestantism and so on, but it also doesn't have a sense of sort of its own traditions or anything like that. And how you reground that kind of Catholicism in something that is actually competitive with the availability of God in some Protestant churches is a really big question. And then you also have, I think, in the more successfully liturgical forms of Catholicism, there is a danger too in losing, some of the pastoral care for the poor and so on. I mean, this is, again, a sort of a caricature sometimes that people make of traditionalist and conservative forms of the faith, but it's not always entirely unfair either. So I think there is this constant struggle to make sure you are fitting all of those pieces together. But when you do, you have something that really does, I think, feel like the fullness of Christian faith.
I'm not blaming the council at all. It's not the council's fault, but after the council, the church I came of age in, those things fell apart. And when you look at the great figures prior to the council, think of a Thomas Merton, a Dorothy Day, a Fulton Sheen, think of even like a Graham Greene and these great figures. There was an integration of those elements that I think was compromised, and it fell along political lines. And so talk to older priests today. It's all about the streets and the poor and social justice. Talk to the young guys. I know them very well. They loved cassocks and surplices and the liturgy and so on. And I keep saying, I tell my priests here, my young seminarians, the higher you go liturgically, the lower you should go in service of the poor, and vice versa. Dorothy Day, who no one served the poor more ardently than Dorothy Day, and she loved the benediction and the mass and retreats, and she was constantly in prayer on her knees and so on. I think we have lost something in the years after the council. Those things fell apart, and it's still a problem. As we debate within the church today, I want all that together, and I liked your focus on all three. We're running out of time. Can you come back? I hope when the weather maybe is nicer next summer, come back. But can I ask you one last question? So it's related to religion, but it's more into the political, cultural. I was reading something recently about this idea of the West. People defending Western civilization, the West. A couple things. Does the West still exist in some coherent way? To what degree is Christianity related to it? What are the what?
This
are,
is a small
I know
question
this,
to see me out.
30 seconds. Is the West still there? Let me put it that way. Is there still a West that's either worth identifying or defending?
I'm not completely sure.
Yeah.
I have a lot of mixed thoughts on this question because, I am a political conservative, a cultural conservative. I have this sense that sort of Western civilization, Western Christendom, the links between the United States and Western Europe, that this is what the civilization is that I'm invested in and defending. But I do wonder if we are in some kind of turn where the Christian civilization of the future, it may not be right to see it as a simply global civilization, which is, I think, again, where the post-Vatican II church sort of assumed that we were going, right? That there would be this sort of global culture. Catholicism is obviously a global religion, so it has to sort of think exclusively in those global terms. I tend to think more that I feel like America is likely to remain a place of resilient cultural dynamism, religious and otherwise, over the next century, even as other parts of the world, for reasons frankly connected to basic things like demographics and birth rates, go through an extremely painful period of retrenchment and transformation. And this is true of Christian parts of the world, like Western Europe and Latin America. It's true of non-Christian parts of the world or less Christian parts of the world, like East Asia. And in that environment, I don't know, I wonder if we are just living through the turn from the Western era to the American era. Like, I think if you're thinking like, who knows, Christ may return, who knows what the machine God may enslave us all. Who knows what the 21st century has in mind. But if you are someone who is some kind of cultural conservative, but wants to look forward in a dynamic way, American civilization is Western. It contains core aspects of the Western heritage. But I do sometimes think that there's more of an advantage in this moment in saying, as Americans, that we're defenders of American civilization.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out what American civilization looks like in the 21st century. It's a big question. We're all arguing about it. We have pretty painful politics because we can't agree on it. But that is the right way to think about it, that we're sort of in a new chapter of the story rather than just sort of trying to extend the European drama through another century or two. But I'm not sure if that's right at all. So, and I do think Americans, and especially American Christians, are naturally invested in a particular way in what's going to happen to Western Europe, and which is much more secularized, has a very different landscape of immigration and cultural change around Islam, much direr demographics. I don't want to say, oh well, we'll just we'll see you in 100 years while we do our own thing. But even like I'm from the Northeast. We're here in Minnesota. The energy and dynamism of America right now is in this belt that runs from the Southeast through Texas up through the Southwest and then up up to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Parts of it are quite religious. Parts of it are secular and weird. Parts of it are California religion and so on. But that's where the energy is. It's in the South and West. That's where Catholicism's energy has shifted. It feels like even geographically, we're moving physically away from the old sort of Atlantis center of gravity, and something new and weird and different and American might be coming into being there. I don't know.
No, I appreciate that. And next summer we'll figure out all the details.
Yeah, in Santa Fe.
In Santa Fe, okay. Listen, thank you, Ross. It's a delight being with you today.
This has been a great pleasure.
Great conversation. Thank you.